Thank you. Well, I too would like to thank you for turning up tonight. It's a pleasure to be here, and I enjoyed the last time I spoke, and I think I'm going to enjoy it tonight as well. We didn't get together and talk about how we were going to divide this up, but actually the two papers do fit together, but we don't always agree. And I think that may come out in what I say. Can I at the outset say, I don't think Vladimir Putin is a particularly nice man. I would not like to have him looking after my cat. But in many ways, that isn't the point. That isn't the point. And one of the problems, I think, in the way in which the whole issue of Russia and its foreign policy has been handled in the West has been that people have tended to see Mr. Putin as someone who can't be trusted and who they would not like looking after their cat.
Propaganda bullshit.
Okay, Brian, you can ask a question at the end. I'll give you 10 seconds.
One of the most interesting things, I think, is the way in which the West, and in particular the US, has framed this Russia issue, and in particular the Ukraine issue. And I want to talk a little bit about the way that's been framed. And this is where I disagree with Ben. I think that the way that the US, and to a lesser extent, but certainly them as well, the EU has handled this Russia issue has actually been appalling. It's because what I do is that I'm taking the view from 1992. Soviet Union fell in 1991. What has been the Western attitude to Russia, and in particular the American attitude to Russia, from 1992 on? And I would argue that it has been almost unambiguously assertive. Russia's foreign policy has been assertive, but the American foreign policy and NATO's foreign policy has been assertive as well. At this stage, I'll simply say one thing to give sort of some sense of that. We now have a situation in which American and NATO forces are closer to the Russian border than they were at any time during the Cold War. Now that's a pretty sobering thought when you think about it. We now have NATO and American forces in the Baltic states. NATO has always been in Turkey, but it's the Baltic states which is important because the Baltic states is Estonia's less than 200 kilometres from St. Petersburg. We also have American advisors in Ukraine. We don't have troops, we have advisors in Ukraine. So it's quite clear that the American response over the last 18 months or so has been, I think, an upgrading of the assertiveness that has been there ever since 1992. But what I really want to talk a little bit about to start with, although I've already started, is the way in which this whole issue is framed, the way in which it is understood. And I'm going to take as the source of the framing two of the major American newspapers. The New York Times, seen as probably the leading paper in the country, and the Washington Post. And I confess I have not done this work, I am reporting what others have done. Okay? In the last 2 weeks, there have been reports come out that conflict has once again broken out in eastern Ukraine. Not on the scale of what it was before, but conflict has broken out. How do we explain this? Or more to the point, how to the New York Times and the Washington Post explained this. Simple. It's simple. It's the separatists who are supported by Putin. They're the ones who are doing this. They're the ones who are starting lobbing shells across the ceasefire zone. This is all a function, according to these newspapers, this is all a function of Russian meddling in Ukraine. What they don't talk about is the situation within Ukraine itself. What we have in Ukraine, essentially, is almost a failed state. The government that was brought in the aftermath of the Maidan demonstrations in 2014 now is clearly bankrupt. The Prime Minister, the country is bankrupt as well. The country is that much in hock to Russia for fuel supplies, to the US and to the IMF and to the EU, have enormous debts. But the government itself is bankrupt. The Prime Minister's approval rating, Yatsenyuk, makes Bill Shorten look a champion. He has a 5% approval rating. The President tried to sack him a couple of days ago, but was unable to, because the President's position itself is weak. A significant number of leaders, of the ministers in the government, have resigned, including those ministers of the government, one Lithuanian and one from somewhere else, I can't remember now, who came in to try and help clean the place up, have resigned, and they resigned saying, we're getting nowhere, nothing's happening. The government then is in chaos. The streets in Kiev are for the most part quiet, but there have been a series of demonstrations by right-wing groups. Right-wing groups were instrumental in the 2014 demonstrations. They weren't the main force, but they were there. These groups are once again mobilising. 2 weeks ago, they bombed 3 Russian banks in Kiev. I don't remember seeing this reported in the Sydney Morning Herald or in the mainstream media. Furthermore, the Azov Battalion, which is the Ukrainian army, when it was fighting the separatists, was supported by a series of militant groups which formed themselves into so-called battalions. One of them was the Azov Battalion, and it is led by some of the elements who have been instrumental in the street demonstrations in Kiev. So they are again extremely right-wing, and some of them openly admit to being fascists and sort of accord themselves that label. They are active on the front between the rebel sections and Ukraine, the main part of Ukraine itself. Now, the point I'm getting at is that if this sort of information is not coming out in the mainstream press in the US, it's not being publicly recognised by the regime, by the American government, although clearly some of them know about it. It is this sort of situation which is framing the current developments in Ukraine in a way which almost by definition demonises the Russians and demonises Putin. Syria was brought up. Syria is presented in the West as we, that is the Americans, with however many other in the coalition, are fighting ISIS. The Russians are bombing the moderate rebels. Now, you know, apart from the fact that I've never heard of a moderate rebel, basically what they're saying is, we the West are fighting ISIS, Putin is standing up for his crony in in Assad. Well, they're right. He is standing up for Assad.
And kicking twice ass too.
But, unless I'm mistaken, the reports about ISIS beginning to retreat began to appear about the same time the Russian airstrikes began. Now, you know, it might be coincidental. It might be because the Allies have been more effective in what they've been doing, or it might be that the message that we're getting is not the full story. The other way in which this sort of thing is framed, and this is where I'm now going to get much more onto the Russian situation, is that it's interesting if you look at the press. It hasn't happened out here all that much, although I don't read the Australian, so it might have been there. But you're getting a number of reports of coming out of American press, American think tanks, American academics saying the Putin regime is unstable. Putin is going to fall. I mean, there was one that I saw last week, said 10 reasons why the Putin regime won't last. You know. This is a bit like, speaking of Brzezinski, arguing in 1950 that the Soviet Union was going to fall. And he was right. He was right, it did fall. It's just that it was 40 years after he said it.
Could you speak into the mic?
Can I what?
Speaking to the mic.
Ah, sorry. Okay. Yeah, so the argument that the Putin regime is unstable or going to fall. Now, what I'd like to suggest is that all of the evidence that we have goes the other way. That rather than that regime being likely to suffer major setback at the next election, probably not going to. The interesting thing is that if we look at what Putin has done ever since he came to power in 2000, but it's been increased since he came back in 2012, and that is that what he's done is that he has put forward a narrative about Russia, its place in the world. And that narrative is essentially Russia deserves to be and should be a great power because of its cultural background and all the rest of it. We're being prevented from being a great power, in part because of some of the things that we have done in the past and we're doing now, so we should organise ourselves better and all the rest of it, but also we are being prevented from achieving our birthright by these people outside, by enemies outside. Now, as with all of these sorts of narratives, there's an element of truth in it, but there's certainly a lot of elaboration as well. But the paradoxical thing is that that narrative and the strength of that narrative gets reinforced for Russian citizens by what the West is doing. If Putin is saying Russia is being screwed by the Americans and by the Europeans, and then what they do is that they put sanctions on, they move troops closer to the border, they continually criticise Russia and Putin, sometimes with grounds, sometimes without. They exaggerate those criticisms. All they're doing is building up the belief in the veracity of what Putin is saying. So that the Western response, I think, has been, in its own terms, self-defeating. Because if we look at Putin's situation domestically, in June of 2015, the Levada Centre, which is, there are two main polling agencies in Russia One was independent and was taken over by the government a couple of years ago, and then the most important people from that organisation left and set up their own organisation, which is now the Levada Centre. The Levada Centre, in the middle of last year, conducted a poll, and it showed that Putin had an 89% approval rating. Now, you know, it may be that the poll is fudged in some way, but it's unlikely to be fudged enough to produce an 89% from a very low base. And given that it's the Levada Centre, it has credibility in terms of its past. In February of this year, the other polling agency, but this was then reinforced by Levada, found that if an election was held today, 74% said they would vote for Putin. 11% said they didn't know. So that means 15% of the population may oppose him. It doesn't sound as though the regime is being white-anted by popular disapproval. And in many ways it's surprising, given the effect of the sanctions, given that life has become more difficult for people and the economy, as Ben said, been slowing down and creating difficulties. But what these figures seem to suggest is that Putin is not being blamed for it, that the West is being blamed for it. Now, Putin is partly responsible for it because he put on embargoes against the import of food from countries that were then embargoing Russia, so that the disappearance of many Western goods from the shops was a function only indirectly of the sanctions, more directly of Putin, but doesn't seem to have stuck with him. So there doesn't appear to be a lot of popular opposition to him. When we look at the organised political forces, Putin was very clever when he first came to power, and he's continued to do this. And that is that what he did was that he took over the ground that was occupied by various nationalist forces. In the 1990s, people were very worried about Russia because there looked to be a whole swag of nationalist extremist forces who were opposed to Yeltsin. And what Putin has done by in part putting forward this narrative I was talking about is that he's taken the ground away from them. So the nationalists aren't much of a problem in terms of support or otherwise for Putin. It's unlikely that they will run effectively against Putin or his party. The main source of opposition that some people hope to see is the Liberals. Because if the nationalists are sort of in the bag with Putin, and the communists are really much more nationalist than they are communist, although they sort of oscillate between the two, they are also there. The only other area that people look for is the Liberals. And there was widespread hope both in the West and among Liberals in Russia that the assassination of Boris Nemtsov in February of last year. Nemtsov was a leading Liberal oppositionist politician who'd been a deputy prime minister under Yeltsin, and he was killed in central Moscow. The blame for it, a number of Chechens were arrested, but of course, you know, that's the default position in Moscow. If there's a crime, basically you pick up the Chechens. And there have been suspicions that his assassination was brought about on the orders of the leader of Chechnya, but nothing's ever been proved. But it was thought that this might actually promote the Liberals to come together. This was the widespread hope. The leader of the Liberals was a former Prime Minister whose name was Kasyanov, and he was leading up the party that Nemtsov had been associated with. Last week, Grigory Yavlinsky, who was a Liberal politician who was very prominent under Yeltsin. He stood for the presidency a couple of times, including in 2000, never got anywhere. He announced he was going to stand for the presidency next time around, but he said he would not, or his party would not unite with Kasyanov for technical and political reasons. What this indicates or reflects is the problem that the Liberals have in Russia of getting together and combining. Because unless they can do that, they're never going to be able to develop a constituency that might support them. So the Liberals, I don't think, are going to be a major problem. It is possible that we could see a replay of the demonstrations that occurred in 2011-2012, following the election later this year. It is possible. And certainly what appears to be developing, which we didn't see in 2011-12, was that not only middle-class people in the big cities might join some of those demonstrations, but there's also some signs of increasing labour unrest. And it's possible that could develop as well. But at this stage, it's unlikely that it's going to create any major problem for the stability of the Putin regime. So basically what I'm saying here is that the image that the West has been operating with in trying to handle the Russian situation has not been one which has facilitated an effective policy. Is there a Putin problem? Russia's foreign policy has become more assertive. There's no doubt about that. I think he's also become somewhat more opportunistic. I don't think that he had a long-term plan about taking Crimea, although there is some evidence that there were meetings in the Kremlin in December of 2011 talking about the takeover of Crimea. But I think he's basically opportunistic. And in a sense, the tragedy of what's happened over the last, I think, 2.5 decades, and in particular over the last 10 years, because I'm including here the Georgian wars in it, what's happened has been that the way in which the West has conducted its foreign policy has created the opportunities and the openings which Putin has taken advantage of.